Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. On behalf of Vivvi, I'm so excited for you to be with us today. I'm Rachel Duda, the Vice President of Learning at Vivvi, and I'm so excited to talk about overscheduling, which I know is on so many of your minds, including mine. As a mom of 4 young children, I'm constantly, especially now in the spring, carting children from extracurricular activity to extracurricular activity. And I know how challenging it is to figure out what's necessary and what's beneficial for your children. I also know the pressures that come with packing our children's schedule, pretty much from the time you become a parent, with classes for anything you could dream of being pushed in every mom group that you're probably a part of. Today, we're joined by Jasmine Daniel, licensed marriage and family therapist and board-certified behavior analyst. She has more than a decade of experience working with children and families, and she's a parent herself, so she knows this topic intimately too. Together, we're going to do our best to address some of your pressing questions about child development, parenting pressures, and so much more. If you're not already familiar with Vivvi, I'm just going to give you a quick overview about what we do. Vivvi is on a mission to reinvent childcare and early learning for today's families. We currently have 5 campuses in New York City, including new campuses in Dumbo, Brooklyn, and Midtown West Manhattan. And they specialize in early learning and care for children ages 6 weeks to 5 years old. We're also really lucky that we partner with employers of all sizes to bring childcare and early learning to their working parents as a benefit. And we truly believe that it's our mission to support the whole family, not just the children, with high quality learning and care. And we give parents education and resources in those early years, which we think is so important, and which is why we're hosting this conversation today. Before we get started, I'm just going to share a couple of program logistics with all of you, and then we'll dive in. We have about 45 minutes together today. We'll use the first 30 minutes to go through questions with Jasmine, and then we'll go to the chat from some questions from you and some questions that were previously submitted to us. The chat is open, so at any time during the webinar, please feel free to jump into the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions from you as possible. And again, I just want to start by saying that this is a really, really big topic, and there's no way that we're going to cover everything in these 45 minutes. Jasmine and I were just talking about that before all of you hopped on together, but I do promise that you'll walk away with at least one practical tool that will help you feel more equipped for whatever's going to come your way. So with that, let's jump in. So first, Jasmine, let's talk about the issue here. Why do parents feel so pressured to participate in so many activities, even for their very young children? I remember when I was a kid, I just ran around the neighborhood and I didn't do anything organized until middle school or high school. How have the stakes been raised, and what's the impact emotionally, physically, and financially on parents?
I think there's a few things. So breaking it down into one, why we feel so compelled to have our children in so many things is one, thinking about us as parents, and wanting to feel like we're good parents. You want to have people say to you, wow, you're a great mom. You're doing an awesome job. And so in order to do that, we have as many touch points as possible. So we have space for that to happen for us. And so there's research studies that show that we draw as parents a lot of our worth from how our children show up in the world. So when somebody compliments your child on something that you had no control over at all, you feel amazing about it. And you're like, yay, look at me. But when someone says something to you like, oh, your child is doing X or can't do whatever the thing is, then at the same way, we feel terrible about our parenting and are like hyper vigilant to make sure we feel that feeling again of someone saying, oh, he's a great swimmer. He does great at soccer or whatever the thing is. And so oftentimes, especially in like the social media era where you can see what other people have their children doing, we want to feel like we're part of that crowd. Another piece of that is thinking about, and we're talking about your audience, which starts at 6 weeks, you might be on maternity leave or parental leave, and you're like, I haven't talked to another adult. This kid is not saying anything back, and I'm losing it here. How do I get around other people who know what I'm feeling like? And so there's that, you're compelled in that way to go out, to seek people, to see someone who can talk to you about what you're feeling like and how things are going. The other piece is thinking about after COVID and things like that, people wanting to make sure their children have social opportunities because they may not have had them, or there may have been, I mean, you may not have seen certain family members or whatever other things, or now we're remote. And so there's not ways for your child to be out of the house unless they're in an activity. There's a lot of different things in that way that lead us to this space. And then really thinking about our children and how to make them the best versions of themselves. So when we're really thinking about that, thinking about what is age appropriate is kind of the next question that we have to think about, and what age should we be involved in things. I think we've talked about this before. Our experiences are opposite. I started organized activities. Actually, my parents started me in organized activities around 6, which is still older than this age group, but still pretty little to be starting activities. And so part of the reason maybe I'm a self-proclaimed overscheduling mom, maybe because I started those activities really little. And so my child is very overscheduled as well. I know we need to I want to keep moving because I don't want to take up
absolutely.
But
yeah. You know, one question that I get a lot as an educator from parents is about the learning and developmental benefits for children when it comes to other activities, extracurricular activities. Can we talk a little bit about the benefits from activities at every age? When does a music class matter? A movement class? And is it okay to do the class anyway, just to gain a little social interaction, even if it really doesn't matter for the child?
First, I'm going to answer your last question first. Yes, it's okay. It's okay to do it, even if it's just for you as a parent, because we know parents' mental health is directly connected to their children's mental health. So if it's helping you have more space to feel like, hey, I had this little 30-minute break, and so now I feel like I can be more present for my child. I feel like I had an organized way of connecting with them today, so I want to continue to connect. That's okay. Thinking of age-wise, one great resource it's not a plug really. The CDC has a milestone resource that you can look at. You can download the app, and they have very specifically at what ages specific things show up and how to look at those things. But if we're thinking about it, the only activity, and I try to think about this because if you're thinking in growth mindset, and we don't have to get long into that, kids can learn anything at any age. People can learn at whatever point. The only activity that is hard to gain after you haven't learned it small is really pitch and music. That's the only one, and I'm aware of that because that's why I started music so young, because my parents were aware of that. But that it's really, I mean, there's so many artists now, specifically music artists or different musical artists that did start later in life and still have really amazing gifts. So in terms of when they need certain things, really early on, music is super helpful in brain development and helping children to be able to open different parts of their brain, to be thinking about different things in different ways. So having even music playing at your home can still give you the same desired effects as really a music class, especially really little. Under 1, you can play music at home. It's not necessary that you go somewhere. However, that is fun and connecting for children. Sometimes fun and connecting for parents, often more the case. But really thinking about that. The other piece is like water safety. So I know a lot of parents are really into swim and thinking about that. And a lot of times that's parent-child. So it's bonding, it's connecting. But I know there's other groups of parents who are like, we can just get in the pool and I know how to swim and I'll just make sure my child is safe. So all those options are okay. Water safety is one of the earlier ones. So those two things, music and swimming, maybe the two activities that you can kind of start early, but not necessary if you're like, I don't have time for this. Specifically thinking about children who are preschool age. If they're in school full time and they're doing a bunch of other things, being bored is a part of development. And so really giving them opportunities to be bored at home really increases the likelihood of them having active imaginative lives. And so we want to make sure that's possible too. So thinking about that is a really important piece as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I also, I have 4 kids. My oldest is 9 and my youngest is 4. I had the child that screamed their lungs out at infant, like it was like a mommy and me yoga class. And that to me was like, I didn't want to deal with that. And so that was the last class that we did. And so I think for parents too, of like really figuring out, it's not just about the child, but it's about how it makes the parent feel too, especially when they're so young, you're so actively involved in it, right? If it's not working for you as a parent, then it's not going to be working for your child either.
Yeah, and I think a big piece of that is making sure you go in with a goal in mind. So like, what is the purpose of this? If I'm going to, let's say I'm going to child yoga for your example, and I'm going there, connect to other parents and see people who have the same worldview as me. And my child is screaming the whole time. So now I'm anxious the entire time. Now my child's watching me, they're feeling anxious too. We're both sitting here. It's a nightmare. Absolutely a great decision to say no more of this. And so really looking at that, if you're going into music class because you're saying, I want my child to be a great pianist, and so I have to start them now. And then your child's like banging on keys and not like, and you're stressed the entire time. Again, not the best choice. If you go in and your child's like, this is amazing and I love it and I love everything about this, then maybe we're thinking about that being a good fit. But everything won't be. So it's really about exposure and then assessing and saying, this, no, but let's not do this again. Or yeah, like, this is really awesome for them.
Absolutely. And a question that we got over and over again when the questions were coming in from this webinar was like, what is the ideal breakdown of structured versus non-structured activities? Jasmine, we talked about so much of this is individual, from how many siblings a child has at home to what's each family's capacity for adding activities to the schedule. And how do you figure out what works for your own family? I know for me, having 4 kids and working a full-time job, my activities for my children were going to the local playground and not sort of like signing up for classes. And that was a very unstructured activity, but the amount of learning that comes from just going to the local playground, even when they're kind of young infants, is pretty spectacular in my opinion.
I think when you start thinking about different ways of learning, right, and what kids need to be kind of balanced humans, there's benefits to either side, right? So thinking about like what things your children learn from being at the playground to learning like flexibility and playing with others that sometimes in a structured group, you don't learn in the same way. And also because I'm able to go to the playground and my parent is able to be there with me, there's connecting time available there versus a drop-off class where there's not the build on that connection. So I would say the first step in thinking about if activities work or don't work for your family, or one, if you're always exhausted, it's not working. That's the first thing. If you're like this, I can't, if I have to get in this car one more time, I'm going to lose it. Not a good place to start. I think thinking about activities from in a proactive way. So thinking about like, hey, what do I need? What am I needing this for? Okay. On, for example, if it's a drop-off class and you're like, hey, I need childcare for an hour, I get this childcare consistently, and so I'm able to do a thing I want to do. I get to go to the gym for this, whatever, 45-minute class every Thursday, and that's the only exercise I'm able to get, then that still works. But if something else changes in your schedule, like let's say a parent retires and they're available and they're like, hey, I want a full-time grandparent, then you can fill that same gap with grandma watching the baby and you're still able to work out. So sometimes it's not necessary to have that thing again if you're keeping that goal in mind. The other piece is, and it's hard around this age group because at around 3, parents no longer become involved in the activities, which make it tricky because I see as I'm kind of scrolling the chat right now, a lot of people are talking about drop off and kids like being like, no, I don't want to leave you. And specifically if you have a child who's at school all day, and then they're somewhere else all day, They just want that time with their parent. They want some dedicated time, and having dedicated one-on-one time. So thinking from a research perspective and from what research says, we know that having dedicated time with your child one-on-one every day shows way more results in terms of their emotional intelligence, social emotional learning, connectedness with their family than anything about being in extracurricular activities. There's nothing that tells us these people are better humans because they're in extracurricular activities. But we do know when you have one-on-one time with your parent, that helps your nervous system, helps you learn how to calm, regulate better. It helps you be more connected, to take the things your parent are saying more seriously, to heart, all of these things. And so really thinking about how that connection works matters. So if you're choosing between an extracurricular activity or time you could spend even 15 minutes alone with your child, that's I think the clincher.
I agree. And I have two pretty anxious children who would not easily go into unstructured activities. And, for me, it was really kind of paying attention to, do they have the same issue going to school? No. Okay, well, maybe that's a sign to me that they need, just some downtime, right? And this kind of like moves me into the second question, which I really want to talk about unstructured play. And when you're constantly scheduling your child for activity, they don't have that opportunity to be bored. And I will say, I've worked in education and in schools for the last 20 years, and children don't know how to be bored anymore. A lot of children are very used to being scheduled from one activity to the next. And when sort of like left with some free time, they say like, what do I do? And they look at the grown-up in their lives to kind of help them figure out something to do. And I go back to my own childhood, right? Where, we used to play every game under the sun outside or in our basements, from sun up to sundown. And, kids don't have that same kind of ability to like play imaginatively and to sort of in that moment of like a little bit of boredom, what can I do? And I think that's such a invaluable kind of opportunity for a child. They need to understand and experience what it's like to be bored, and then kind of figure out themselves what to do to kind of fill that time. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
I think some of it is a revolving door. So as you're saying that, I'm thinking about, as parents, we don't give them opportunities to have unstructured time. So then in that unstructured time, they come and say, Mom, play with me, or whatever they want. And so then you're like, I'm exhausted, so I need this kid in something, so I don't have to do that thing. But then they're not learning how to do the thing, and they're just becoming older kids who then still need you to entertain them. So really, the best thing is when you're not sure how to get them into that unstructured play, thinking about how you start off. So if you have a kiddo who like you're recognizing, let's say at 2 is like grabbing you and they want you to come play with them, giving them even like a little basket of things they can play with, and just kind of increasing that time that they're able to attend to an activity by themselves. And so it's really short starting off. I think people often overestimate how much time a child should be able to spend alone. So even when you're at like 5 or 10 minutes, that's absolutely fine. And I mean, this is easily Googleable. You can look up times that children are supposed to be able to attend. I remember Googling this myself, even as a professional, because I knew the answer, but I was like, I need there to be a different answer, because I wanted my child to be able to play alone for like an hour at 3, and it was not real. But I think really being able to attend to one activity on its own, 5 and 10 minutes is fine. So if you can find multiple activities and kind of stack them back to back, which is what I learned to do, you can get more time available, but it's also making sure they have the skill to do those things. So sometimes it's sitting with your kids for 5 minutes, showing them how to color, and then giving them a coloring sheet, see how they do by themselves for another 5 minutes. And then over time, then you can hand them a coloring book and they're going through that thing for 20 minutes. And you're like, man, my kid knows how to do this activity. Then you need to watch the crayons, because then your walls may become books as well. But really, like thinking about those things just little by little, and thinking about how you add in some of that time. I think 30 minutes is a good starting place. And I'd say 30 minutes of knowing that at some point you're probably going to have to tap in and do a little bit of something with them, but giving them, even like if you can do the 15 minutes of one-on-one time and then trying to give them 15 minutes and recognizing, depending on their age, they may or may not be able to do that. But really, imagination is such a big part when we're thinking about child development, and we're thinking about even like development and thinking about even developmental delays in some ways. One of the major things when I've worked with families that have children with developmental delays is looking at some of this imaginative play and where that goes. And there's often been, not, I won't say often, but I've worked with families where their children have been kind of misdiagnosed, or even they show up looking one way because they didn't have that imaginative play skill. And as soon as they had it, it opened up so many other avenues in their brain. And then they came back and it was like, oh, they were able to attend better at school because now they know they can play at home. And so they're not trying to play in class and do other things. And so it looked like they had certain behavioral issues when they really didn't. They just didn't know when they'd be able to play because they were doing so many other things. So really, it's super, super, like you're saying, so important that we give them that space to be able to sit and do stuff. And part of that is also structuring your space. So you have like their room is a safe space that they can go in and play. And you as a parent don't have to be super concerned that like something's going to break or fall or whatever the thing is. Or if you're like, yeah, their room's not that place, having a playroom, having a play corner, it does. I mean, whatever space you have available. I know I have a friend of mine who made their kids' closet their play space. Like, yeah, your whole room is not available as like, I know I'm going to be worried if you're everywhere, but kids are tiny. And it's not like she locked them in the closet. She actually took the door off the closet. So it was like a little nook that she made that had like activities and cubbies and things. And that really supported in that imaginative play.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. So in thinking about parents that want to schedule and add more activities in for their child, but don't have the means to do so financially or the time to do so, what are some alternatives to signing up for expensive classes? Because classes are not cheap, that's for sure.
I think the first thing, like you said, going back is the park. There's so many parks to go to. Even, I mean, and you can think about that big and small. You can look at local parks, you can look at national parks, you can look at any types, any parks near you, but it's always fun. I think sometimes I forget about all the parks that exist until we get like birthday party invites in like every local park. And I'm like, I've never been here before. Even going to those places, you get to have a new environment, new community, different people around. If you go to one park and you're like, these kids at this park don't play with my child the way I like, you can always go to another park and see if like they can have better social interactions there. Because maybe those kids go to the park together and they know each other really well. And so they're not being as inclusive of your child as you think or whatever the thing is. So being able to do that. Libraries, super important. Thinking about a lot of libraries have like reading time available, but even if not that, it also gives your child the skill of learning to be quiet in certain spaces. And I remember that was something as a kid, I went to the library. My dad took me to the library every Saturday. And I think it was like one of the hardest concepts I ever had to learn is like whispering and like, how do you whisper? And like, but you can't hear me like this. Let me just talk in my regular voice, and really understanding that concept. But again, those things really support children in understanding different environments, how I change certain behaviors in certain environments, that everything is not like home is. And so really seeing different ways of being is something that really is supportive of their development, specifically young, because when you have a kid who knows, okay, in certain places, if it's really quiet in here, I want to whisper. If it's really loud in here, I want to talk loud. That's a really important life skill, right? I mean, how many times are you somewhere as an adult and you're like, man, this person's talking really loud in the restaurant. And so just having those opportunities, thinking about that, going out to restaurants, having opportunities that are novel for your children. So thinking about ways to go over different family members' houses, having certain play dates, or even, I know, really cool thing. I know we discussed this a little bit, but I'm thinking about, I have a cousin of mine who moved to a different state and found a couple, and they do childcare exchange. So they're like, hey, well, they have like a regular setup where I don't know what day it is, let's say Tuesday at 7 o'clock, one of them is watching the other one's children. So like 7 to 9, the first and third Tuesday, I have your kids and vice versa. So you have consistent time that one, they're getting social interaction, but also you're getting some downtime, which allows them to have like date night, or sometimes it's not date night. Sometimes it's I get to clean my house now time, or whatever it is, but the things you need to be able to accomplish at that time, but also your children are getting exactly what they need and could get from social interaction with just a couple more kids versus larger groups.
Yeah, I love what you said about the playgrounds. That was something that I used to do with my kids, and I still do. That idea of like choosing a different playground each weekend to explore and kind of like framing it as an adventure for your child or for your children. For those of you that are in New York City, I mean, there's so many amazing playgrounds around, and even outside of New York City, there's some great playgrounds. And another piece of that also is, different playgrounds challenge different gross motor skills. And so, from kind of a learning experience in that way, not only are they like learning social interactions with other children who are there and like having to negotiate and compromise and share and all of those kinds of things, but just the different equipment at different playgrounds challenge different gross motor skills. And so thinking about it in that way, there's so much learning that goes on there too. And my kids love to go to the library. We take a walk to the local library, and even if we don't take out books, just having 20 minutes to kind of explore different books is learning in and of itself. It's that learning of reading. And even if the children aren't reading yet, if you have toddlers, just that act of looking at books and making choices about books based on your interests is really powerful too. And so, those are really easy things that, that you can do that doesn't require money. And it also doesn't, for those of you that don't like to be overscheduled like me, it doesn't kind of put that pressure on you as a parent too.
One thing I love that you said about the library is like not taking something out, right? So oftentimes when kids go places with you, you go to Target, you go to wherever, whatever stores, they're used to transactional things at places. So being able to go somewhere and leave things there can also support in that. Like if you have a kid who's always like, every time we go in the store, I have to have something. Going to the library and being able to experience something and leaving without it is something that's super helpful with that skill. And I know oftentimes I have parents ask me about that all the time. Like I always take my kids to the store and they always want a thing. Well, practicing going places without getting things in the library is one of the best places to do that, because that's what it's built for you to be able to look at things and then leave without having necessarily a thing in your hand is also something that's a really great learning experience for a child.
Absolutely. And another thing actually that I just thought of, for those of you that are in New York City or even not, there's so many great museums in New York City, and they can be overwhelming to go visit a very large museum with a young child. But if that kind of thing is overwhelming for you as a parent, you can even just, go into the museum and choose one exhibit to look at. And something that I like to do both as a parent and an educator is bring a clipboard for my child and just sit in a quiet corner and have your child sketch or kind of observe the art around them and kind of draw what they see. And that is, even if you don't do the whole museum, you can keep going back to the same museum over and over again on the weekends and kind of choose different exhibits to go to. And not only are they, kind of going back to what you said, Jasmine, about kind of understanding behaviors of how to behave in a museum, but that art education is really powerful too. So that's also something great you can do as a parent that doesn't cost money or doesn't cost a lot of money, depending on where you are.
Yeah, I was literally, as you said that, I was thinking the exact same thing. So I'm glad we're on the same wavelength. I was also thinking about in museums sometimes thinking about like time objectives. So if your child after 15 minutes is tapped out, maybe you do a 10-minute museum visit. And I know it may seem like, why would I do that? Because you can build on that time. So if you go in and do 10 minutes and you say, hey, next time we come, we're going to walk in that room. And so they have something to look forward to. And then you can say, we saw something red in that room. What do you think it was? And so you can kind of challenge their imagination to think about what could be in that room for the next time. So then they're excited to go and maybe want to stay a little bit longer because they're like, I want to know what's in this other room. And so you can make it a really fun activity that's also supporting their learning and development and that imaginative play and thinking abstractly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. Jasmine, I'm looking at the chat also now, and I'm also kind of going through some of our questions that were previously submitted to us. And I think it's time to kind of dive into some of these. One of the questions that just came through our chat that I find interesting, both as an educator and parent, is kind of that balance of like extracurricular. How do you balance extracurricular dropout? So kids saying, I don't want to go, or I don't want to do this, when you've already signed them up for something. So how do you balance that with like the values of sticking it out, seeing things through, sitting through discomfort? Yeah, that's a challenging one as a parent.
I think I'm looking at the chat too, so I want to start in one place and then I'll get to that place. I think one of the things the most recent question asks about is anxiety in little ones. And so really thinking about what anxiety means, what it looks like in a small child. To answer this question, does anxiety look higher since before COVID? For children who lived through it, a little bit, yes. So a lot of the small children that I've worked with before and after COVID and really talking to families, it's not just little children. All anxiety is higher since COVID because we never thought there'd be a time where we could be stuck in our houses because there's a global pandemic. Like, I don't think that's something we had on our vision boards for what was going to happen in 2020. And yet we were in that position and having to kind of figure it out. Nobody could have planned it. There was something we had no idea about. And so those ideas that children now are even aware of what germs are is such an interesting thing. And so they're mindful of things that we as small children didn't have to be mindful of, or thinking about masks or why somebody has a mask on, or even being able to read facial expressions. I find that small children at this age, because of kind of their mask life, can tell just from here what somebody's thinking about, which is such a super cool skill that you can read a face.
Yeah.
Like somebody smiling at you and you can tell that through a mask as a really little kid, because I remember at the beginning of COVID, I'm like, I don't know what's happening. This person in front of me, but the really small children were able to do that. So, and thinking about that anxiety, one, as a parent, childhood anxiety looks so different than adult anxiety because it really is and can be dissipated by a really strong connection with a parent. So, as an example, children like really scared of, let's say, something under their bed, as an easy example. Having a parent in their room all of a sudden makes that less scary, right? Because childhood anxiety is really about, and there's studies that show this, you can see the levels drop, even if there is real pain, real fear, real possibility. There's a dog here, but my mom's standing next to me, so this dog somehow can't get me, because that's how a child's mind works. This adult has the ability in some way to support me in making this scary thing not scary, even if there's a real threat. So in saying that, building a really good emotional connection with your child is super important in helping decrease their anxiety. Not saying they won't be anxious. Some children have more anxiety than other children, so this is not kind of a blanket statement, but it is supportive for any type of anxiety to make sure you have that connection. The other piece of that is looking at, again, what is your goal when you're going to something like swim, where you have a child who's like, I don't want to get in the pool, mommy, I don't want to leave you. And you're dealing with that piece. One thing that oftentimes parents are immediately tempted to do, right? If I see my child is anxious, I want to remove that anxiety. And sometimes that will reinforce the fact that this could be a scary thing, when you know, in fact, that this is not something scary. So I would say, one, if you have a child who's like, I don't want to do this thing, thinking about it in bite-sized morsels. So it may be, hey, I talked to this swim teacher, my kid's going to get in the water this one time, and then then they get to get out. So we've worked on one thing at a time. Hey, they were able to do this. Water wasn't scary. They liked water. And sometimes you'll have a kid, I can tell you my kid's first day of alone swim. As a professional, I'm going to be embarrassed to say this, but I'm going to tell you guys anyway. My kid, he's screaming at the top of his lungs, no, I don't want to get in the pool. My kid loves to live in water. He lives in water. No, I can't do it. I have to poop. And he knows I have to poop is like, I can't put him in the water. So he's screaming and yelling and all. And I'm like, the most embarrassed mom. And I'm like standing there and I'm like, what do I do? I don't know. I don't know what to do. And thankfully, the teachers there were super amazing. And we already had a really good relationship because we did Parent and Me. They were like, you can walk out. And I was like, I'm going to feel so terrible because he's going to have a meltdown. I walked out the room. That kid was so quiet. No more screaming. No more, nothing. Got in the water, started swimming immediately. And I was like, what just happened right now? And so I felt like, what did I do? How did this happen this way? And some of the time it's because your kid knows where your buttons are. So they're like, I know my mom's not going to leave me here. But then when they see, wow, I was able to do that thing. The second time, he immediately got in the water, didn't say bye to me, nothing, just got in and was ready to go. So some of the time that's the case. Now, on the edge cases of that, when you have a child who's screaming, crying, we're 10 times into this. We don't want to cause damage in ways that don't feel good either. So if you recognize your child is not able to do things, again, one, bite size, get in the water, get out the water. Wow, you were able to do that this time. Get in the water, maybe put your face in the water. Oh, done. And we're out of here. And you can get them there. But removing the demand altogether teaches them that something that you know is safe is now dangerous. So we want to be really careful about that specifically. Also being mindful of what's happening in your life at the time. If there's big life changes already happening, you just changed preschool, you just changed this, and now you're adding another thing. Maybe it's not the right timing for having a new activity added on. So really thinking about what those things look like when we're thinking about anxious children. The other piece, again, is having a clear routine really supports with anxiety a ton. So again, it doesn't have to necessarily be scheduling something, but sometimes, okay, if we have one activity on Monday and they can expect that activity, but they know Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then the weekend from 3 to 3:30, even just that 30-minute time, I have free time. I don't have to do anything else but lay on the floor in my room if I want to. Then that really supports your child in having less anxiety, because some of the time it's because I don't know when I'm going to have time again. I don't know when I'm going to be able to play with that one toy I really want to play with because it's inconsistent and every day I don't have time to do that. So really thinking about those things.
Yeah, I think I liked what you said, that it's not a kind of blanket approach, right? It's more of an art than a science in kind of like figuring out what this is. I'll give you an example from my life. My third child, when he was 4, I signed him up for a dance class because he loved to dance at home and we would have music, and I thought he was going to be like my Broadway star. So I signed him up for dance class. He did not want to go to dance class, but I knew he enjoyed dancing and I knew he enjoyed music. And so we went back to dance class the next time and he cried and didn't want to go. And I said, you know, you don't have to get up and dance with the other children, but we are going to stay here and we are going to watch. And I will tell you, I think there were like 12 classes in that session. He didn't get up and dance at all for any of those sessions, but we sat on the side and he watched and he enjoyed watching. And so I think like in that case, it would have been very easy for me to say, like, what are we doing here? He's not getting out of this. He's actually not getting up and participating. But the fact that he was there and we saw it through and he was just kind of enjoying that act of watching, even though if I like forced him to participate, he would have had a total meltdown. That's one example. And I think depending on the age of your child too, like you can have real conversations with them. So, you know, you can say to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old and above, you know, I know that sometimes before we go to X class, you feel a little bit nervous and you don't want to go. But I also know that when you're there, you enjoy it. And I have this conversation even now with my 9-year-old who plays baseball. Every time when it's time to go to baseball, oh, I don't want to go. I hate baseball. I don't want to do it. And I say to him, Mac, I know that this is your response and this is what you say, but then you actually enjoy it when you're there. And it's my responsibility as a parent to make sure that you go and have that positive experience. So I think like really having those conversations with kids is important. And you can start to have those conversations when they're kind of in that 3 to 4-year-old range, like they can understand what that means to them. But like kind of naming it and saying like, I noticed that this is what you do before class, but I also noticed that when you're there, this is what I see. And I think that's an important thing to kind of think about.
Just piggybacking off of that, even thinking about, again, shifting your goal if there needs to be a shift. So exactly what you're saying about the dance class, it may be, okay, now my child loves to learn to watch dance. So now maybe he's not the Broadway star, but he's the Broadway reviewer. Like he reviews the Broadway shows now because he knows how to watch them. He knows what good dance is supposed to look like. And maybe your dream for what it was has to shift as a parent. And oftentimes we get so connected to an idea for our children that we can't shift because we're like, no, I see this though. If they can just see it how I see it. And the thing is, as a parent, we have the ability to step into their world. They don't have the ability to step in ours in the same way. So really it's us having to shift our ideas around things. And oftentimes as parents, we have a power struggle with a child. And and again, at that same time, having those power struggles are beating up that relationship because your kid doesn't feel seen or heard or those things. So being really careful with that and not making them feel like, I know oftentimes parents are immediately triggered to say, well, I spent all this money on this class, or, you know, if you do this, then you're not going to get this. If you don't participate in this class, then we're not going to be able to go do this other thing you really like because this is what you need to do here. And that sometimes erodes away at your child being able to feel safe because they may or may not have asked for it. And oftentimes parents are like, well, they did ask for it. They asked to go to this and then they got there and they didn't know what to do. And how many times as an adult do we feel the same way? And so really humanizing children's experiences too. There's plenty of times I thought I wanted to do something until I got in there and then was like, okay, my idea of what this was and what it actually was are very different things. And so giving children that grace as well to say like, hey, this may look different, but then you all making that goal for yourself, whether it's sitting on the sideline, whether it's having a small amount of participation, or whatever the case may be, really figuring out what that looks like. And the other piece, thinking about anxiety and something that's tangible for you to take away is if your child is really having a hard time separating from you specific, and it's like, it's because they don't want to be away from you. You can also give them a small transition object or something to have of yours so they can take that with you and feel connected. I mean, it could be as simple, you can do, if you're doing bottom, no spending money, whatever, you can get a piece of string, cut it in half and say, look, me and you are connected by the same string. You tie one around their wrist, tie one around your wrist and say, every time you look at that, think of mommy. And they can have that small thing that they say, this is me and mommy's string. And they have a thing that connects the two of you. So while they're in that activity and they're feeling like they're missing you, you can look at that string, you can play with that string and mommy's with you. You can have a little, something small that can fit in their hand if that's something that they're able to have at whatever that activity is. And that's really supportive of them being able to have a piece of you with them without having to have that. And then the last thing I'll say, and I know we're short on time, is really practicing the coping skill of being away from you. So like you're saying, you can have those conversations starting as early as 3, and sometimes they may get it, sometimes they may not, but you can also teach them like deep breathing in those moments. So, hey, sometimes when I feel really nervous, and even modeling that for them, hey, when mommy has a new meeting today at work, where I have to meet a new person and I'm really kind of nervous about it. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take a deep breath and count to 3. Can you do it with me? And then you have them do that thing with you. And then when they feel nervous, they'll learn that exact same thing. Oh, I'm feeling nervous about going to this new class, but I'm going to take a deep breath and count to 3. Or you can even refer to your time if they don't remember that. Hey, remember when mommy felt the same way? I took a deep breath and count to 3, and you have that as a model. And then right before they go into class, they say, hey, remember when you're in there, if you're feeling nervous, you can take a deep breath and count to 3, and you're teaching them that kind of coping skill as they're going into things that can really support in being in activities or away from you.
Yeah. And I think what you shared there too is kind of how your child responds to an activity. And this is a question that just came through is, at what point do you call it quits? And when do you kind of get that sense that children are overscheduled? And the way that a child responds to a particular class or going somewhere is often a sign of like them telling you, I'm either exhausted and I can't do this one thing. I do think that if your child is scheduled after school for something every single day, it's too much. Again, it goes back to that idea of like needing some downtime. And if they're really resisting doing something, it could be their way of like telling you that, you know what, like, I just can't do this thing. I always thought back to myself, like even as a grown-up, after a long day of work, you can't try to get me to go and do anything else after a long day of work. And it's the same for kids, right? Like if you think of everything that they go through on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in childcare, daycare, school, every single kind of minute of their day is scheduled, and they're getting so much out of school, daycare, whatever it might be, that they do need that downtime. I always think, especially like when you're starting a school year, you should always start with less, and then you can always add more to it. I know a family that I'm friends with, they have a rule in their family that kids are allowed to do like one sports activity and one like arts kind of creative activity, and that's their limit. And kind of if kids want to do anything more than that, they say like, well, we can try that next time. But I think you have to kind of put a limit on, what kids are doing, because they're tired, like they're just tired, and then they have to wake up and kind of do it all over again the next day. So I would give them some grace, and also give yourself some grace too, of not necessarily needing to feel like you have to kind of do that. You don't have to do anything as a parent, and guess what? Your child will still be completely okay. I think people feel that pressure of like, if they don't do this, like they're not going to get into Harvard or, whatever it might be. And I can guarantee you like that is not the case. So don't put that pressure on yourself as a parent.
Yeah. The other thing I will say, piggybacking off of what you said, is reframing for yourself looking at this question, what quitting looks like. Because I think sometimes we have to think about what we're teaching. Like if I am uncomfortable somewhere, I really don't like being here, I should continue to do this for the duration of the time that people expect in order to do what? Like what is the other lesson? So I'm teaching the other thing you're teaching. So I wouldn't think of it as quitting. I would think of it as teaching your children to listen to their intuition, to listen to their bodies, to listen to what they need, instead of thinking of it as then they leave. Specifically with the example that was just sent in, if she's in 4 activities, then doing one less is not going to, she's still continuing those other 3. So it's not quitting. It's saying, hey, you know what? My focus is better spent, so I can be better at these other 3 things if I let go of this one thing, versus thinking about it as like, hey, if I'm not doing this one thing, then I've now ruined my ability to ever, because you can add back in gymnastics later. If your child is saying like, hey, well, later on, I really want to do, like, they take a break from gymnastics and then they're like, Mom, I really miss gymnastics. You can always add it again. It's something you can always bring back in. And so really thinking about that. Also thinking about your child's learning style. I think we talked about this a little bit, Rachel. My really overscheduled kid is a super active kid. So although it looks like a really overscheduled calendar for most people, a lot of other children, for him, at the end of the day, he's still like, what are we doing next? And I'm like, sleep. So I think if you have a child that's like that, sometimes having those activities are really important and helpful because they like that type of stimulation. But if you have a child who's actively showing you, telling you, you're like, this kid is having meltdowns every day, or I'm really, I'm struggling, they're struggling, we're going back and forth with each other every day, and I'm annoyed every time we have to go to this class, and they're annoyed, and it's not great for our family, then even thinking about even a trial week off. It doesn't mean you just have to quit it all together. You can also say, okay, you know what, this week we're not going to do that thing and see what our week is like. And after that 1 week, if you and your child are both like, that felt better, then you can make that choice. Or if you're like, I think we can add in one more thing. So the opposite way, I think we can add in one more thing. You can do a trial week. That 1 week feels like, oh, that was too much. Then you can make adjustments. So remembering that nothing is always. You can make decisions and you can change those decisions at any point. And remembering that that's what you're teaching, instead of like quitting or restarting or all of these things. You're just teaching your child that that's what life is. It's constant negotiation of priority and responsibility, and that's okay.
I love that. I love that idea of taking a break and kind of seeing how it feels for everybody. Okay, Jasmine, I think we have time for one kind of like quick fire question before we go. And the question is, what's the one activity you think is a must for a child of any age? Ooh. I just lost you. Hold on. There we go. Okay.
The must activity. I think that's hard. I think if I'm answering it as a not scheduled activity, I would say the must is the thing I already said, which is one-on-one time with your parent. That's the must activity. The thing, if you have no time for anything else, is I'm sitting down with my kid. We're talking about outside of the home activity. What is the must activity? I think our world is made up of a lot of water. And so swim, I think, is something that I feel is very important, because you at least want them to be able to survive if they're in water spaces. So I think that's a really big one, just so they have that as an option, specifically really little. And I don't want to feel like I'm like a commercial for swim safety, but I will say that children have less fear small when they get into water. And as they get older, that it's something that's a great big thing that maybe they're nervous about getting into. So even if it's introducing, it doesn't mean constant swim classes or anything, giving them the ability to be comfortable in water, just because it's so much harder when you're older. I know several adults who cannot swim, and they are so afraid of it as an idea. And it's such an interesting thing to me as an early swimmer, because it wasn't something that dawned on me to be afraid of. And I think that's a hard one. So I'd say that specifically, but I know that's a tricky one, because sometimes kids are like, absolutely not. I don't want to be wet. I don't want to be in this water. I know for me, again, the priority adjustment for my parents, I ended up having ear infections really badly. And I got in the swim. I was months old. I was a small in the swim because my mom's a swimmer. And I got ear infections, so I couldn't keep going to swim. And so my mom had to make really big adjustments for her own ideas around things, because I couldn't go. I couldn't keep going, because every time I went, I got an ear infection. So really being mindful of, again, what your child's body is telling them, what other things are, but really, no matter what research shows, parent and child time is the most important time. Everything else is extra, and treating it that way is really important for you and your family's health and development.
I love that. What a great way to end this conversation. And I am in complete alignment with you. Thank you so much, Jasmine. And thank you so much for everyone who took the time out of your really busy, probably overscheduled schedules to join us today. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.